You're about to discover the answer to the question, will people cruise again? I'm Gary Bembridge. This is another of my cruising tips for travelers. There is very conflicting information out there about what's happening with cruising moving into next year in terms of are people booking or aren't they booking? On the one hand, we're seeing lots of reports, particularly from cruise travel agencies, particularly online travel agencies, talking about cruising bookings for 2021 looking really good, looking really strong. We're seeing cruise lines, though, as they issue more financial updates, particularly to the SEC in the United States, as they've gone around raising money to improve liquidity to cover them over the shutdown. They talk about future bookings being pretty weak and real concerns around whether they're actually going to be able to attract enough people on their ships. Both of those can't be right, can they? Well, I actually think they probably can. And what I'm going to do is explain why I think that is the case. A lot of it depends on who you're focusing on. I want to talk about 5 different groups of cruises and what I think is going to happen and why those numbers that we're talking about and seeing are so different. One of the big things overarching all of what happens with cruising is what's becoming increasingly known as cruise shaming. There's been an enormous amount of negative publicity towards the cruise lines and the role of cruising. Media especially has gone out quite aggressively anti-cruising, creating that new expression of floating petri dishes, which everyone's banding around, but a really strong position against cruising and warning people that cruising is a really dangerous thing to do. And that has become part of the narrative. The cruise lines and the Cruise Line Association have not yet really been able to change that narrative. They haven't really found a way of really getting a grip of the narrative. And in many ways, they've lost that narrative, I think, and they're going to have a really big challenge to overcome it. So let's take a look at the 5 different types of cruises and why I think we're seeing that conflicting information. First of all, let's talk about frequent cruises. People who have been on many cruises, people who've been on 10, 20, 30, even more cruises, they undoubtedly will return to cruising. And they are the ones that are out there today looking for deals in 2021. They're eager to know when the shutdown ends because they want to get back on a cruise. Most of them will have future cruise credit from cancelled cruises that they're now looking to spend as soon as they possibly can. Those people are clearly out there looking to book cruises. Most of them are going to not get their cruise fix, or they've lost many of the cruises they've got planned for 2020, and they're looking to fill up their 2021 schedule and calendar, and they're looking out for any deal that goes, and they're booking cruises. Those people will keep cruising. Very importantly, they also really understand the whole cruising process. They know the sanitation process, they know the procedures. They're probably much more flexible as changes come in around the way that we cruise. Those people want to get back on board as soon as they possibly can, and they're booking. They're also probably the people that are most likely to be booking with their agents. So they're going to be out talking to their agents, trying to use the future cruise credit, trying to move things around and get things booked. So I think that's why particularly we're seeing a lot of the cruise agencies seeing quite a positive build of cruises. The second group, which is much more challenging and a real challenge, I think, for the cruise lines, is the people who've perhaps been on one cruise, at a push maybe 2 cruises. So they've tried cruising, they don't cruise very often, and they need to decide, will they get back on board a ship? I think this is going to be a big challenge because of all the stuff that we've seen with the negative publicity. But I think what I'm seeing in forums and seeing comments on my channel, I'm seeing lots of people who've been interviewed. This group of people's biggest concern is what happens if they get quarantined. So they're very nervous about the stories and what happened in the shutdown period, where ships were not being let into port, people being quarantined on the ships for long periods of time, often weeks. They were worried about the spread of disease and stuff around the ship. I think that's really spooked people. So although they've been on a cruise and they liked it and they would probably come back as part of their repertoire of vacations, I think that group of people are going to be less inclined to return to cruising and are going to look much more at land-based. I think this is a big challenge. Some of those, of course, will have loved cruises. I think a lot of those, and certainly what I'm seeing in, again, comments on the channel, those are the people who are pushing really hard to get money back rather than future cruise credits. And I think the people who are light cruisers, occasional cruisers, are people who are holding back. That's certainly I've seen. I saw a study in one of the newspapers here in the UK where I'm recording this, where the Independent newspaper, they did a survey looking at people who cruise a lot, people who cruise infrequently, and a very large percentage of those were saying that they would not go back cruising either forever or certainly for a long time. So I think that's part of the challenge that we're seeing as the cruise lines looking at future bookings. I don't think those people are coming back in any big numbers. And you can probably see why, because cruising was only a little part of their mix of vacations. The third group, and this is where I think the cruise lines are probably more worried than anywhere else, that's the people who've never cruised but were considering a cruise. Cruise lines were extremely aggressive at recruiting new to cruise. That was really the lifeblood, bringing people on board a cruise, getting them hooked on cruising, and most of their marketing spend, their advertising spend, their promotions, their incentives, the work they did with agents was all around getting people on cruise, new to cruise. Every time I talk to a cruise agency, we're obsessed with new to cruise, because clearly your frequent cruises, once people are on board, the future cruise people can normally do a good job of trying to cross-sell people onto the next cruise. But new to cruise, getting them on board, people who they know are considering a cruise. This is where and why I think we're seeing the cruise lines talking about demand being so weak, because a big part of their strategy and their capacity and their build was to bring those new to cruise people on. And those are the people who are going to be most spooked and driven away from cruising. They don't know how cruising works. They've seen all the negative stories. That cruise shaming issue will be a challenge. Their friends, their family will be like, oh, are you really sure you want to go on a cruise? And this is where I think we're going to see a huge issue in terms of the fall off in demand. So frequent cruises will be back. Pretty much everyone will be back. The people who've done it once or twice, a big drop-off factor. New to cruise, getting them on a ship is going to be really hard, because even great deals will, in my view, not overcome their reluctance to get on board a cruise ship, certainly for a pretty long period of time. The fourth type of cruise is one that probably the cruising industry doesn't really worry about as much, and these are the people who would never cruise. They're saying, I will never go on a cruise ship. And there's two groups of people there. The first group are people who think that cruising is not for them, because they think it's only for old people, or it's for people who are not very adventurous and want really a safe way of cruising. They see themselves as being much more adventurous, or they want to do much more of a deep dive and go off the beaten track. Those type of people never saw cruising as for them, so they weren't even really in the new to cruise consideration group. They will stay very much seeing as cruising not for them, without a shadow of a doubt, and all the stuff that's happened will only reinforce their perception. The other group, of course, are people who absolutely despise cruising. They think it's a terrible thing from an environmental and over-tourism perspective, or they just think it's a dangerous thing to be on. And I do see a lot of both those groups of people certainly commenting on all my stuff around, being pretty much, they hate cruising and they think it's a terrible thing and want cruising to go away in its entirety. So those people will not cruise, so they will never cruise. So they're definitely a group, but they are not one fundamental to the cruise industry turning things around. Another group that is of really big concern, I think, to the cruising industry, who are probably holding back or nervous about booking, and those are senior travelers, and particularly those people over 70, because in the whole run-up to the shutdown, a new rule was brought in where those people, and also people who are more vulnerable, had to get a medical certificate before they were allowed to board a cruise. And that was introduced originally on a recommendation in the US. It then spread into the UK and other cruising regions, and is not going to go away, I don't think. So if you're over 70 at this point in time, you have to get a medical certificate. Many cruise lines, of course, the bulk of their passengers are older passengers, and during the course of the year, older passengers are a really big fundamental part of the whole cruising process for many itineraries, particularly out of school holiday season. And I think those people are going to hold back cruising till they really understand how safe it is and the procedures for them to get back on board. And that's a really big issue for the cruise industry, because they are such a fundamental big part. And I think many of those will not go back to cruising. What percentage they are, I don't know, but I think certainly in the next year or so, a lot of those will hold back. Also because the isolation for many of those is going to continue way beyond when younger people are allowed to go out. As you can see, the answer to will people cruise again depends. So we're going to see in some areas people really ready to go back cruising, and others, I think increasingly people are going to say no to cruising. And I do believe this is going to be a massive challenge over the next year or 18 months for the cruise lines, who have huge amount of capacity built on a growth industry. And a lot of people are going to be nervous about booking and reluctant to booking, and how they deal with it is going to be very interesting. Part of the reaction I think we'll see over time is more and more better pricing and deals, but that's really going to get the diehard cruisers on board. They have to get the narrative back once it's really clear how cruising is going to work. I do believe they've lost the narrative completely around cruising, and it's a big job to get it back. and they have a lot of work to do to convince people again that cruising is a great option for travel. I'm of course falling in that first group. I love cruising. I know how cruising works. I can see how they're going to figure it out over time, and will be one of those people that will be booking and getting back on cruising. But it's a massive, massive big challenge. Will people cruise again? It depends, is I guess the answer. I have loads more tips, advice and points of view about cruising, so why don't you watch another one of those right now.